With this documentary, we hope to showcase the story of British Somaliland soldiers who fought for Britain. Official documents tended to treat them collectively as units, battalions, regiments, brigades, and as most were not literate, few individuals were able to produce memoirs or accounts of their war experience. This is a people's story, an account of men whose lives were largely forgotten. European interest in the Somali region developed after 1839, when the British began to use Aden on the south coast of Arabia as a coaling station for ships en route to India. France and Italy, requiring similar coaling facilities for their own ships, established stations in the northern Somali regions.
In the 19th century, it was all about India. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and the route to India was vital, particularly because of the French, who were always trying to break it. So it was originally around Africa, around the Cape, and then up to India. But once the Suez Canal was built, then the route down the Red Sea was absolutely vital. And so the staging post, the main military base protecting that, was Aden. But Aden couldn't feed itself, so they needed somewhere for meat and food to be grown, and that was Somaliland.
France and Britain, after brief risk of armed confrontation, agreed in 1888 on a demarcation line between their relatively minor shares of the coast. The French region became known as French Somaliland. Italy region was known as Somalia Italiana. British influence in the coastal areas around Zeila and Berbera was formalized during the 1880s in a series of treaties, promising protection to the chieftains of various local Somali clans. The region becomes a protectorate under the title of British Somaliland. The British immediately recognized the affinity between the Somali people and their camel chargers. The Somaliland Camel Constabulary was an early attempt to harness this natural affinity militarily. On the 12th of March 1914, the British set out to create what was to become the Somaliland Camel Corps, to maintain order in the protectorate. During the period between World War I and World War II, the Somaliland Camel Corps was reconfigured to better defend the protectorate in the event of future war.
This huge protectorate of Somaliland was administered by less than 24 European officers, which is not very many, but they were quite distinctive people. They were distinctive because many of them, the majority of them, had actually elected to go to Somaliland. They tended to be a little bit eccentric. They tended to be the sort of people who didn't toe the normal sort of, corporate line, the normal colonial military line. They were people who thought of it.
markuu Soomaalida taariikhdeeda hal ugu yaaba ammaan baa laga bixiyaa waxa iinana waxa loo sheegaa bay yiraahdeen waa niman madax adag oo ku madax adag Ingiriis marka ammaantooda ay ka yaabaan ba Ingiriiska ninkii daacadahee nadiifi oran jiray alle waa kan kuwa doonaysaado horta xoogooda raggaas waa qaar waxa oran jiray malaadada ammaantaarihi ma jirtee waa nimanka eego iyo kuwaasay ku dalmi jireen mid yar iyo dhif baa isdalcin jiray madaxdayga waxa kan Afrika ka iyo dhulka madowed siday afka oo soo madax jabiyo kaasuna gardaru iyo habuule iman
what when the government wants to recruit either police or military, they will give an announcement and say we are going to recruit men of such caliber, tall, healthy, and many of them will present themselves, and selection will be based on appearances, height, and health. And they joined because they needed the money. The salary was not high, it was £1 a month, but
anigu waxaan ka bilaabay anigoo yara baan French raaco jookara ku yar gacan jookara la oran jiray way yaan xaraam ma military kaamil kor la oran jiray maan ka bilaabay oo nin baan gacan yar u noqon 5 rubood baan qaadan jiray hal Somaliland burco way kaamil korkii military-ga nin kabtana buu ahaa way maanta u soo joogsaday ninka u soo noqday waxay ahayd kaamil korkii aanu hawliyo farda ka raacay burco qaldaamu qaban waad shidka markaan joognaan ninkii kamaandhaana ahaa kabtana isjiin way biyaho jidaan nugaala ayaanu anagoo yaryaroo 3 u shaqeeyay deesho kala yaala yaanu ku dabaal tagnay annagu waxaan u sheegnay waa dalkiiniyo hadii jabaan silaan ugu meelanay way kii kamaandaan loo ahaado nin aan la jeclayn ahaba noo yimido intuu nacaari buu ka soo baxbiyo wuxuu dabay inaan isagu noo dhaafa halkii baan anigu ka calooday kii u shaqeynayay iyo kii kale ka baxay biyihii way anigii baa caloodado inta tuurtuurana caadado waxaan ka calooday biyahan aad leediin
siduu idinku yiraahdo uga baxa oo aniga galiyay
waa laba saddex dhagax baan ku tuuray kii buu qaadan waayo ka caloodado kii aan u shaqeyn jiray buu isagu wuxuu yiri yarkaagu waa jikibi eri sharbood ma khasiray taleex baan loo muuqata markaas oo meel qole ku xaal la yiraahdo yaanu degnado waa shilaan biya baan meesha de hilba ku qalanado aan degni way anoo calaysanoo daradiisii ka calaysan maa soo bax markaas ninkii diinaar la odhan jeedo 5 rubood buu ku khasiray markaasaan kii boyga ahaa iga safeeyay noo dhaxeeyay ina keeno kii aan u shaqayn jiray markaas waxaad ku tiraa ninkan gaal anigu inaaga qabtanadii bidaadiibsatayna miyi
dhulkan aanaa leh
mushahara yar baan kuugu shaqaynayay qalda markaynu tagno horta waan soo noqonay waxaygiina waan doonayay hadalkii gaalna way soo ka xanaaqi jireen deynana gaal baynu naqin wuxuu yidhi waxaad ku tiraahdaa caydiid waxaad ku tiraahdaa annaad sidii inankaygaan ku ilaaliyay adiguna gaal baad igu sheegtay
maxay keentay tii markaas
ereygii waxaan ogaaday ninku way damqado dee asluulxumaadaan ku hadlay iyo miskiinnimadu hadlay baa damaqdo inuu ii naxariista oo dee dadnimaba aniga iigu jirto anna gaal ka shaqaystaan islaa isna waxaan lahaa wuxuu kuu haystaa inaan yaroo soomaalida gacan yaro oo boyda u shaqeeyo dadba kuma yaqaan ninkii waan bartado xeradii boy baan waan dalacado boy baan noqdado waanu ismaranado sidii inankaygii uu kaga dhabeeyey
most Somalis, almost 99% of Somalis relied on their animal wealth. So what they were getting as a salary was supplement the earnings of the family. So the father will be working, the rest of the family will be looking at the animals.
I think Somalis joined the army because there's a certain tradition of being a warrior, I think, among Somalis. The clans spent quite a lot of their energy, it seems, in raiding each other's camels and sometimes women. And to be a warrior was it was what the young men did. And I think the army, the British Army, was an opportunity for them to express that in another way.
Somaliland Camel Corps was 1 battalion, less than 1,000. And not all of them took part in that war. They took part in the war, but some were in Boromo, some in Barao, some in Hargeisa.
In September 1939, the Somali Camel Corps were small and inadequately equipped for future wars. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, a commander-in-chief of the Middle East Commands, was appalled by the under-equipped force that was supposed to defend an entire colony. In 1940, as a result of his concern, the unit was partially mechanized and further defenses were built. However, before the upgrades could be completed, the funds dried up. Mussolini's declaration of war on June 10, 1940, 2 weeks before the fall of France, found him with no enemy immediately to hand. He therefore ordered his forces in Abyssinia to attack the nearby British colonial garrisons. Wilson was born at Sandown on the Isle of Wight. His grandfather, Charles Thomas Wilson, was the first missionary from the Church Mission Society to visit Buganda in 1877. He was educated at Marlborough College, where fees were reduced for the sons of clergymen, and he became a house captain. He later was awarded a prize cadetship to attend Royal Military College in Sandhurst. Wilson was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the East Surrey Regiments on the 2nd of February 1933. He was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in 1936 and was seconded to the 2nd Nyasaland Battalion of the King's African Rifle in 1937, serving in East Africa. It was during his service that Eric had met Omar Kuchog, where their fates would change, forming a strong and lasting friendship and united both families. During the Italian conquest of British Somaliland, the heavily outnumbered British-led forces made their stand on the hills around Tog Argan. During this battle, from the 11th of August 1940 to the 15th of August 1940, Eric Wilson and Omar Kuchog selected a strategic area on a high ground known as the Observational Hill that overlooked the only road through the main area of the battlefield. The Italians were edging closer to the battlefield to face the British army.
The first that they knew that the Italians were actually coming close was that they saw hordes of Remi, of Somali Remi, with all their livestock, fleeing in front of the advancing Italian army, because if the Italians caught any of them, they stole all their livestock and either confiscated it or ate it.
Okay.
So all of the Remi from the area were running towards the British position.
For protection.
And of course, my father at the time realised, and always commented, that there, amongst all of those people, were the cousins and uncles and aunts of Omar Kuchog and many of his men.
Right.
And so my father said the instinct they must have had to have abandoned their position and gone to help their families as they fled past must have been very strong, but they were so well trained that they stood firm. Suddenly, this massive onslaught of Italian army began, and my father and Omar Kuchog were quickly the subject of most of that fire. So not only had they had waves and waves of Italian infantry running up this hill, trying to overrun their position, but also they were joined by artillery. And by the end of the first day, the Italians had come so close with their field guns, they weren't even using the sights. They were just pointing them at my father and Omar Kuchog, and they were the centre of the fire because they were right at the front.
Right.
And there were legendary stories of how Omar Kuchog was getting. I mean, he was a very excitable man.
Yes.
He had a very loud voice, and he used to get excited quite easily, my father said. And he was absolutely furious at this, and my father said, he was firing this machine gun, just sweeping it backwards and forwards at all these people running up towards them. And he was shouting at them, and he was firing so fast that the gun kept boiling. because there were so many bullets going through it. This first day, there was one shot that went and knocked the gun off. They put it back on its feet, repaired it, got it going again, whilst all these people were rushing towards them. And then another bomb came in, and this time it just went straight through Mukujog. It just hit him, killed him instantly. And they were stood like this. I mean, they were right next to each other. So it was as if a shell has hit you, blowing you up, and then all the metal also blew my father up, and blew his ear up. He was cut, and and it also broke his glasses. So he couldn't, because he wore glasses, he couldn't really see very well. So that was the end of Mukujog. And my father said that, that evening, as soon as it was dark, the fighting stopped, and the other Somalis that were there took Mukujog's body away. And this is that shell. These are the pieces of shell that from the bomb that killed Mukujog and wounded my father, which is remarkable to see. And these were quite big. I mean, this is part of one that didn't hit them. This one landed outside, so you can see it would have been about that long. And these were coming from the Italian artillery over open sites. They were so close. And the next morning they began walking to where they believed the British army would be, and were captured by some Italians. And what had happened, without their knowledge, was that the British army had done a run-up. They'd left. They'd gone to Yemen.
They assumed that he died?
They had assumed that he was dead. They had given him no command to retreat, which they should have done. And as my father actually said in an interview to the Independent newspaper in the 90s, he'd basically been abandoned.
The defeat of the British armed forces to the Italians remained a thorn in the history of British military advances during the Second World War, and a source of embarrassment, as this was seen as the first campaign the Italians won, and that British Somaliland was the first colony to fall to the enemy forces in World War II. Winston Churchill at that time was furious and criticized General Wavell for abandoning the colony without enough of a fight, despite the troops being under-equipped and was completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the Italian forces.
The Italians, having overrun this position the previous day, had told the Red Cross that everyone was being killed in action. And so officially my father was then dead. The Italians that captured him, being somewhat disorganized, took him to Jigjiga, where he was treated for his wounds, but they never notified anybody that he was alive. He was then taken as a prisoner of war to the borders of Ethiopia and Eritrea, where he stayed for 7 months. Still, no one notified the British authorities that he was alive. So we have, copies of his obituary that was published in London, in the Times and the Daily Sketch, in all these newspapers, about this fantastic, this hero that had fought to the end and everything. And then he was awarded posthumously this Victoria Cross. Meanwhile, he'd recovered from his wounds. He was learning Italian from the guards in this prisoner of war camp. He was also digging a tunnel to escape.
When the Italian forces surrendered following the East African campaign, Wilson was released from captivity in 1941. He then returned to England and received his Victoria Cross from Buckingham Palace in July 1942. Eric Wilson maintained his insistence that the Victoria Cross awarded to him to be regarded as an honor he shared with Omar Kuchog and the other Somalis alongside whom he had fought. Sullivan was a year old when his father passed away and recalls the story he knew of his father and what life was like for the Kuchog family following his father's death.
inta badan ninka anaa uga wareysa wuxuu ahaa Eric Wilson oo isaga ay waqti adag meel soo wada mareen dagaal wada galeen geeridaba ku timi ninka ugu dambeeya noloshiisa arkay aabahay oo ahaa aad baan u xiisay jiray uga wareysan jiray isaga waxaa la geeyey iskuulka 1949 elementary oo miyi baa ka yimid qayd yar baa sitay badow baana ahayd miya iskuulkan iyo wax kale ma garanayo balcawad rooba gelin waxba gelin iskuulka markii nala qoray maxamed axmed cali yuusuf xaajane baa wax qorayey allah yarxamu cabdi ilaahay naxariisanaasi wuxuu yidhi tugu soo warig buu yidhi adeer in ayaa tahay markaasa wuxuu yidhi inaa joog baan intuu kor u naxay buu igu soo boodo madaxa ay qabtuna adeer mayna cumar axmed baa tahay anigu waaban ooyba gaadhay ninkan halkii joogada aabahay garanaya ileen ma yar baan ah markaas excited baan noqday ninkan aabahay garanaya waaban ooyi gaadho halkii buu fadhiisay hal timir waan ceel u qabay biyigaan isku ogeyn xaalkeeda halkan soo dhigay gacanbu subag weynay soo dhigay halkaasuu henry intana sii duubo oo markaad gaajooto waa u kaalay cabdi saciid marka magacii aabahay buu igu soo dhaweynaya garashadu aabahay garanayay ee igu soo dhaweynayay nin wanaagsan buu ahayn xarisanaasi iyo aad baan u xusuusa ma ilaawo marka isaga iyo reerkiisii faamiligiisii oo dhan I respect them markaan aad baan u ixtiraamaa family muxtaram way wada ahaayeen.
Decades after the war had ended, Eric Wilson received a mysterious phone call from someone who claimed to have known Omar Khashoggi and had wanted to meet with Eric.
Nice to meet you, Eric. How are you?
Right. Fine. How's the family?
Everything's all right. How are you?
One morning, there was a strange phone call that my father answered. And there was a man who wouldn't give his name saying, "Are you Eric Wilson?" And my father said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you remember a man called Omar Khashoggi?" And my father said, "Well, how could I forget him? Some of the shell that killed him is still stuck down the side of my body." And the voice on the other end of the phone said, "Well, I am Hussein, I am his eldest son, and I'm in London. I want to come and see you." So my father said, "You have to come now." And the next day, we went to the station, which was about 6 miles away, and I came with my father, and there was this man, got off the train, and it was like discovering an uncle that you didn't know existed. There was something familiar about Hussein. It was really so familiar. I mean, he had to be related, that it was so familiar. And Hussein stayed, and he had come all the way to London. He had gone to the Somali embassy. He had used all possibilities to find my father. And from that moment on, the Omar Khashoggi and the Wilson have stayed in contact regularly and have shared many, many things together. And now my children are playing with the great-grandchildren of Omar Khashoggi.
To this date, the Wilsons and the Khashoggi continue to maintain a close bond, which has now spanned over several generations. Hamish recalls his journey to the battlefield where Omar Khashoggi had passed away.
I actually decided to go to Somalia by bicycle because I had been told, rightly or wrongly, that I would be followed and that anybody I spoke to would be followed and that it would be very difficult to have freedom of movement. So I was looking for a way that I could confuse the security services into thinking that I was a harmless idiot. And they wouldn't be able to follow me. And to some extent it worked. Because once I left Mogadishu, they sent a police motorcycle to follow me for a while, but he got bored after about an hour and went back. And then after that, I could go out on the road and basically I could talk and meet, local people without anybody seeing me. So in that respect, it worked. In another respect, it was a really silly thing to do because it is very, very difficult to cycle in Somalia. But not only that, but what I didn't realize was in Somali culture, the bicycle is a child's toy. And, any normal adult would never be seen on a bicycle.
Yes.
It's not like in India where a bicycle is seen as a sort of prestigious means of transport. So as soon as I got out into the me, I remember being stopped by three Geljiri, and they were doing this, this, it's like this. And then they looked at me, and they stood there, and they looked at the bicycle seat, and they said, you know, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to Hargeisa. And they said, no, no, no. Then they said, you've lost something. And I said, what have I lost? The engine. There's no engine. And then they looked at the seat again. And then they said, uh-oh. You know, if you sit on that all the way to Hargeisa, no girl will ever marry you. You will be damaged for life. So they said, throw it away and walk like that. Well, I persisted up to Hargeisa, and then I did just that. I left it in the hotel.
Yes.
But what was interesting, and the important part of this story, is that when I started getting near to the north, I mean, from sort of Garaway onwards, people knew who I was. They had heard the story, you know, there's this guy, and he's Wilson, Ina Wilson. And by the time I reached Burra, people were coming up and saying, I knew your father. Finally, I cycled one day from Berbera all the way to Da'abur, to where this, and it was a most amazing time, because I have never seen this place. And you know you have reached the sign of this battle because there is a big stone monument beside the road. And you had told me about this, Hussein had told me. My father had never seen this monument. And I cycled past it and I looked at this hill, and then you begin to realize, my God, this is where Umar Kujug died. This is where my father nearly died.
You see this stone-built monument, 1939, 1945, and that's the exact place beside the hill where Umar Kujug died and where my father was nearly killed. But what was amazing about these pictures was that when, after the Civil War ended in 1991 in Hargeisa, I was there, and there was virtually nothing. Everything had been destroyed. And people were going into all the old government offices and pulling out any piece of paper. There was no paper to be had in Hargeisa. So people who were starting to reopen restaurants and so on, you needed something to wipe your hands on. And these two photographs were lying in the street outside the police station. These show the day, I think it was in the 1950s or late 40s. And on that plaque there, that bronze plaque, was included, I think,
1949 or 50.
Something like that, yes. But I believe your father's name was on that.
Yes.
But then, of course,
many names were there.
Yeah, many names of Somalis who died during the Second World War. But then, of course, the stupid thing was that, as you say, the Adonis,
they stole it.
They stole it. They liked the look of the metal because it was very useful for making handles for their daggers, for their tori. So some years later, the nomads took this thing off and melted it down and made it into knives. So, but the stone is still there. And actually, just before the Civil War started, we were campaigning, and Suleiman had succeeded in getting the British government to put back these names. But then the war started.
Despite the monument being erected in Somaliland, Omar Kujug and many other Somalis who served in the war were not mentioned in any official historical documents and transcripts in Britain. I wanted to understand the reason behind this lack of important information and why it was not saved or shared in the public domain.
If you look at it carefully, the ones that are mostly mentioned, even now on Remembrance Sunday, the South Africans, the Canadians, the white parts of the empire get a mention, but all those regiments from Africa are kind of lost.
qiimaha ilaahay muu siinin qadarinta ilaahayna muu siin ma odhan kara lamana siinin pension iyo xuquuq wanaagsan iyo dayac iyo ma lahayn se marka loo eego dowladii kale isticmaalka talyaaniga iyo faransiiska loo eego.
The compensation given to the families of those who were killed I can't remember it offhand, but was very low, much less than what Somalis pay to each other when one is killed. It's called dia. It was less than that. Those who were wounded were given some compensation. That's all.
mar waxay siiyeen islaanta dhuuhoyaaba tagtay qur'aan kun iyo boqol rubood baan maranaya caynkaas wax ugu habaysiiyeen dabeedna markii kaawada halkaa laga dhisayna waxaa la yidhi cumar 3 inan buu lahaa iskuulkaa lagu darayaa kuwa dowladda ingiriisku laba nin kale iga waawanee iskuul age ka way dhaafeen aniga markaa iskuulkii free lagu soo qoray.
When my father was interviewed by a newspaper or given any opportunity to speak about the circumstances surrounding his medal, he always spoke about the Somali contribution and the contribution of Mkujuk in particular. I do not know categorically why there is such reticence about mentioning this, but they seem to think it as some form of affectation peculiar to the Wilson family. They don't seem to take it seriously. And I think it's insulting. I think it's insulting to my father, and I think it's insulting to Mkujuk and to other Somalis. You know, it is not from lack of our pushing that part of the story. The story is as I have just described it. It involves both of those, and certainly my father should take the lion's share of the credit because he was the person that commanded and trained those men, and he was the person who remained at his post to the end. Of course, if Mkujuk had lived, he would have been there beside my father to the end as well. At least they should acknowledge that in this picture there is Mkujuk and the role that he played in the whole saga. I mean, that is quite remiss. That it is wrong that should not be done. So we still make every attempt, and as I say, Degmo, whenever we have a group visit this, we talk about Mkujuk, we talk about my father, and we talk about that relationship and what that symbolised. So we are doing our utmost to at least redress the balance.
In 2002, the Queen honoured the forgotten soldiers of the 2 world wars who have fought for a country that many had never visited. Eric Wilson was honoured by the Queen in the same year and had invited him to join the ceremony.
Memorial baa loo sameynayay dadkii aan ahayn Ingiriiska ee Terwa Carabi Taalidka ee dagaalkii Ingiriiska ugu dhintay oo kuwa qoladina Soomaaliya ka mid ahayd ayaa loo sameynayay memorial. Dabeedna dadkii fiisiga sitay baa la casumayay. Dabeedna Eric Wilson ayaa casumadii loo geeyay wuxuu yidhi waxaa jooga Mkujuk inankiisii waa inuu yimaada halkan invitation. Saasana boqoradu mid ugu soo dirtay markaa Wilson baa markaa isagana u sababa iyada oo sheegay dabeedna sidii baan u tagnay halkii aniga iyo Hamish Wilson israacnay saasaan boqoradu ugu tagnay maalintaas. Wallaahi wax badan waan dareemay waxaan dareemay waxaa ka mid ah beriyada aabbahay markuu ku dhintay halkaa agoonnimadii yaraa aan ku soo koray waan dareemayay dadna farxad badan oo hayado xus baa la sameynayay anna gees ma ka murugaysnaa runtii waa dee maalintaan aabbahay dhintay bay ahayd haddana muslim baa too hadhay alxamdulilah ilaah u naxariisto.
Lest we forget, the phrase of Rudyard Kipling, often inscribed on war memorials, is an apt one for the forgotten men of the colonial forces. Omar Kuchug's legacy in this regard was revived by the Wilson family as a way of showing a deep respect and gratitude to Somali people and their forgotten heritage by setting up a base in Wales called Degmo.
If we were wealthy enough or had enough land that we could create a place where Somalis could come from the cities in the UK and visit and learn about our countryside, but also we could create a little bit of Somali rural life here in the UK. And when the possibility to buy this farm came, I browbeat the person that owned the land into selling, and then I couldn't raise the money. I went to the bank, they wouldn't lend it to me. And my father, and I was getting pretty desperate, and my father, without any prompting from us, said, right, well, there's one solution. the only thing that our family owns of any value is the medal. We should sell the medal and the money should be put towards buying the farm. And my mother, who stood to inherit the medal and any money that would be derived from its sale, also agreed. And so my father sold the medal to Lord Ashcroft, and on condition that he kept the medal until his death. And the money that he got for it paid 2/3 of the price of the farm, and I was then able to borrow the remainder. And so we got the farm, and then with the farm we started the Degmo Centre for Somali Heritage and Rural Life. And that way my father felt that the relationship between the Wilsons and the Omukajugs would be continued over future generations, and it was also a way of paying back the debt to the Somali nation that he felt was owed.
نسوق اسكت شو بدي تقال كرني هيرو ما نقول يا قف مخالص كفرديا هيرو ده كمان نقول أكشن بكون نقول قفكوا أكشن كده ويجيستين دور هيروس أي هاين هذا بحصل الفرع اللي بقول لها.
Every child must look back into the history of his parents, grandparents, and what sacrifices they have made and for what. People of Somaliland have taken part in the British campaigns. In the First World War, as I have said, in Tanganyika, in the Second World War, in Somaliland, Ethiopia, and also as seafarers. Some of them lost their lives. As late as 1982, there were some Somali seafarers who took part in the Falkland War.
dhalinyarada waxa weeye cid aan history lahayn ma jirto, cid aan dad ay ku abtirsadaan taariikhdooda lahayn ma jirto. iminka haddaad aragto halka kan Parliament House-ka hareerihiisa inta dhan sawirkiisa ku yaallo taalada ku yaalla Soomaad arag in ka badan baan oranayna Soomaalidu.
In 1940s, in Hargeisa, we raised the cost of a Spitfire and paid for it. In 1940, there was a ship, I think it was a cruiser, called Somali. Unfortunately, it was sunk at Narvik in 1940.
way yeelan karaan dhalinyarada tanu waxbay weliba barteen tacliim bay yeesheen chance bay heleen aan dadkaa hore anigu aanan helin dad chance ka faa'iidaysan way ogyihiin waxba u tirsananaysid markaa halkana wax kama ahaanaysid xaggana wax kama ahaanaysid halkan markaad wax ka ahaato dalkaagana wax u taraysa meeshaad joogta waana wax ka noqoto.
I want them to remember that they have, their parents and grandparents have made some investment into this country, like the South Africans, the Australians, New Zealanders and Canadians, but perhaps their contribution was much less in comparison to them, but when compared to the population, we have made a lot of contribution and suffered a lot.
ninka Soomaaliyeed taas u ahaan jiray weligiiba madax hoos uga dhigi jiray kor madax u qaadan rag iska dhiga.
People of British Somaliland heritage do not feel like they have a heritage to claim for in Britain. We hope this documentary was able to give you an insight into the lives of many of the unsung heroes who fought for the cause of the empire and whose achievements remain largely unknown. Their stories are inspiring, and their legacy will need to be remembered, appreciated and understood. We hope the stories of our future heroes and heroines are inscribed in the history of our heritage, that their stories will not be unsung.